Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Olga Pisanova. I'm a lecturer at our Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs. We apologize today for the change of speaker. Ambassador Robert Blackwell has informed us he wouldn't be able to make it for our seminar. We are, however, very happy to have here today and always Professor Alexander Lukin. The seminar with Ambassador Blackwell is hopefully still going to take place, and we will announce the details when his schedule is clear. So we're happy to recommence with our seminar for another few sessions. It has proven quite successful while we were all quarantined, and it kept us both entertained and intellectually stimulated. So here we go again. Actually, so much so that we intend to put everything into a volume and publish. We continue with the seminar. The Department of International Relations and International Laboratory on World Order Studies and the New Regionalism, in cooperation with the School of Oriental Studies of National Research University High School of Economics, is holding the 18th session of the Eurasian Online Seminar. As I've already said, our guest today is a renowned Russian international relations scholar and also China expert, Professor Alexander Lukin. And the topic of his talk is going to be, have we passed the peak of Sino-Russian rapprochement? A few words about Alexander. He is head of Department of International Relations at our university, High School of Economics. He's also director of the Center for East Asian and Shanghai Cooperation Organization Studies at MGIMO University. He also holds positions of chair professor at Zhejiang University in China. Dr. Lukin received his first degree from MGIMO, or Moscow State Institute of International Relations. He also received a DPhil or PhD in politics from the University of Oxford and a doctorate in history from the Diplomatic Academy in Moscow. So not many people know, but Professor Lukin has also graduated from St. Tikhon's Orthodox University in 2013, quite recently. He has worked at the Soviet Foreign Ministry, the Soviet Embassy to the People's Republic of China, and the Institute of Oriental Studies of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Then from 1990 to 1993 onwards, he served as an elected deputy of the Moscow City Soviet Council, where he chaired the subcommittee for interregional relations. He wrote frequently cited books such as The Political Culture of the Russian Democrats, The Bear Watches the Dragon, Russia's Perceptions of China and the Evolution of Russian-Chinese Relations since the 18th century. Another one is Pivot to Asia, Russia's Foreign Policy Enters the 21st Century. And finally, China and Russia, the New Rapprochement. He also wrote numerous articles and policy papers on Russian and Chinese politics. Alexander was visiting fellow at the Balfour Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University from 1997 to 1998. From 2000 for a year, he worked as research fellow at the Center for Northeast Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. He is the director of the Center for East Asian and Shanghai Cooperation Organization Studies at MGIMO University, and also served there as an associate professor in political science department for a few years. From 2000 until 2006, he was an associate researcher at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University. Professor Lukin also serves on the editorial board of Asian Politics and Policy, International Problems, the ASEAN Forum. In 2009, he was awarded a medal for his outstanding contribution to the development of Sino-Russian relations by Chinese President Hu Jintao. And in 2012, a medal on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization for his contribution in the formation and development of the SCO. In November 2011, he was appointed Vice President of the Russian Diplomatic Academy, responsible for research and international cooperation. And in 2014, he accepted the position of department head at the National Research University High School of Economics. So, quite a long intro there, Alexander. It's the usual format for those of you who are familiar with it. For those of you who aren't, if you'd like to ask a question, please put your name and question down, if you wish, in the chat window, and you will be called out during the Q&A session at the very end of the talk. Now, finally, we've already asked you that in the chat, but if you could please use your real names. Thank you very much. Alexander, the floor is yours, so please.
Yes, hello everyone. It's nice to hear some old friends and to see old friends and some new people here. Well, for those who read on or do some reading on Russian-Chinese relations, I'm usually known as a great optimist about bilateral relations. So maybe this paper would be would be a little step towards pessimism, but we'll see. Because the main aim of a researcher should be being objective, I would say. So let's talk about the current state of Russian-Chinese relations. And it's interesting that in my new study, I use a Chinese terminology of a new epoch or a new stage in these relations. So in general, Russian-Chinese rapprochement is one of the most important geopolitical shifts of modern times. Recently, it seemed that those who argued, and there are basically two groups of people, major groups of people, those who argue that the closer relations between Moscow and Beijing stemmed from converging of their interests, values, and worldviews. And there was another group of people who claimed that their cooperation was essentially a marriage of convenience. So I would say that the first group, marriage of convenience is, of course, a tactical arrangement for countering attacks by the United States and its allies. So the first group was getting the upper hand. So we'll see where we are now. There was a talk that the mutual understanding between the two countries was becoming even deeper, would continue into the foreseeable future, and that they would form, if not a formal, then at least a de facto alliance. Events indicate that, in fact, in my view, Russia and China have strengthened their interaction, but the question is, will this trend continue forever? I believe that recent developments suggest that the peak of Russian-Chinese rapprochement has passed. And the cause of it is that Beijing's new assertive foreign policy that it has begun directing at Russia as well, not just at the United States and some other countries, as well as several political repercussions brought about by the coronavirus pandemic. Well, first, that I wanted to say that, in fact, it is true that a new high point in rapprochement was reached between Russia and China after the Ukrainian crisis. On June 5, 2019, Russian and Chinese leaders signed a joint statement announcing that the start of a new era in their comprehensive partnership and strategic interaction. Importantly, the term comes from China and shows that Beijing took the initiative in formulating the bilateral agenda. Talking about history of this notion. In 2017, President Xi Jinping coined the concept of socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, which became the bulk of so-called Xi Jinping thought, enshrined into both the states and parties' constitutions. Understandingly, Chinese ideologists began to look for new eras in every sphere of life, including Sino-Russian relations. That prompted politicians and experts in both Russia and China to immediately begin searching for what, if anything, had changed in their relations and what exactly this new era entailed. However, the joint statement itself, nor most of the official commentaries to it speak of any qualitative shift. Instead, they sum up achievements and state that work will continue in all areas of cooperation. Seeking to define that new era, for example, Chinese ambassador to Russia, Zhang Hanhui, listed its 5 main characteristics: a high level of trust between the heads of state, the new status given to mutual relations, the opening of new areas of cooperation, a new level of friendship between their peoples, a mutual effort to create a new type of international relations. None of this, of course, is actually new. In fact, a new era, or at least a new stage in those relations has begun, and not because past trends have intensified, but due to entirely new factors that emerged after Russia entered into serious conflict with the West in 2014, and the US launched a trade war against China in 2016. This new stage marked the final realization by the leaders of both countries that the international system, dominated by the United States and its Western allies, would never admit them as equals. The Ukrainian crisis was the turning point for Russia. Of course, Moscow had serious differences with the West even before that. For example, every time NATO announced it was expanding eastward, with the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999 and during the conflict in Georgia in 2008. But prior to 2014, Moscow had always been willing to make concessions in hopes of maintaining constructive relations with the West. But the West viewed those concessions as weakness and continued moving its military infrastructure closer to Russia's borders. And when the West supported the revolution in Ukraine, a country intimately linked with Russia that brought radical anti-Russian nationalists to power in Kiev, Moscow decided that the time had come to deliver a decisive counterpunch, regardless of how harshly the West was certain to respond. China's watershed moment came with the rise to power of Donald Trump, who saw Beijing as Washington's main opponent in the international arena and who unleashed a trade war intended to force China to abandon the very economic model that had proven so incredibly successful for China. Even though that clash was long in coming and had essentially begun under the Obama administration, it caught Chinese leaders and experts by surprise because their entire economic development strategy until then had been based on the Western theory that globalism was inevitable and that called for a global liberal economic system whose spread benefited the United States and incidentally China. Beijing could not or did not want to believe that Washington would take measures harmful to its own economy for the sake of the geopolitical goal of containing China. The Trump administration saw things differently, however. It concluded that the United States must contain China by any means, regardless of economic losses. Otherwise, the argument went, it could be too late. China would use US technology to beat America at its own game, first economically, and then in terms of political influence in the world. Trump's unexpected attack left China perplexed and unsure of how to respond. Some in China advocated a tough response, while others said Beijing should make significant concessions. In the end, Chinese leaders concluded it would be a protracted conflict and that they should prepare for the worst. Beijing had not rejected the need for talks and hopes to strike a deal with Washington that would at least give China enough breathing space to reconfigure its economy to be less dependent on exports to the United States and its allies and to their technologies. In any case, China no longer holds any illusions that Washington will treat it as an equal partner and maintain their stable and mutually beneficial cooperation into the future. The concept that reflected those former illusions, the concept of new type of great power relationship between China and the US, has fallen out of favor among Chinese experts. This shift in China's view of the future stems directly from how Beijing understands Russia's role. It's interesting that in article in Foreign Affairs in early 2016 that caused a major reaction in Russia, the author, former Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Fu Ying, gave a very positive assessment of Russian-Chinese strategic cooperation, even while reproaching Moscow for being too hot-tempered and perhaps failing to build a judicious relationship with Washington. It is now clear, however, that such caution has not improved China's own relationship with the United States, and that Washington, despite these attempts, continues to step up its pressure on Beijing in every way. China increasingly refers to Russia as a warrior nation, capable of mounting stiff resistance against its enemies and fiercely defending its interests. At times, Chinese commentators even hold up Russia as an example to leaders in Beijing. For this reason, the tough-looking President Putin enjoys wide popularity in China. In addition to these obvious reasons, there are very specific indicators of the fact that Russian-Chinese relations have entered a new stage. They include the following 6 points. First, after 2015, Moscow has granted Chinese state companies permission to invest in the Russian energy sector and high technologies. Until 2015, the Russian government has essentially blocked Chinese state companies from investing in the energy sector, but in February of that year, the then Deputy Prime Minister Arkady Dvorkovich announced that the Russian government was prepared to consider proposals from Chinese companies wanting to purchase controlling shares in strategic oil and gas deposits. The result was that by the end of 2015, Russian and Chinese companies has already signed several major contracts for Chinese investment. This served to advance Russian-Chinese cooperation in the energy sector significantly, with Chinese investment helping to offset losses Russia had suffered from Western sanctions. Second, the process of linking the construction of the Chinese Silk Road Economic Belt Initiative with plans of Eurasian Economic Union has started over this period from 2015, and Beijing has approved of the Russian-Kazakhstani idea to create a greater Eurasian partnership. Third, the Ukrainian crisis had led Russia and China to increase their space-based cooperation. Fourth, Russia is selling China its latest generation weapons, including 24 Su-35 fighter jets and its S-400 air defense system. Fifth, the two countries have intensified their joint military exercises to the point of holding joint naval maneuvers in areas that NATO and other US allies consider sensitive, such as the South China Sea and Baltic Seas, Baltic Sea, joint Air Force patrols over the Japanese and Eastern China seas, etc. And six, Russia is helping China create a missile attack warning system to prevent missile attack, which was announced by President Putin in 2019. So let's talk a bit about Russia's strategic interests, why Russia is doing that. The overall strategic interests that motivate Russian leaders to pursue closer relations with China basically consist of two parts. First, there is naturally an ongoing need to support stable relations with the economically and politically powerful neighboring state. Under any geopolitical circumstances, having normal and friendly relations with such a neighbor would contribute to political stability and economic development in Russia itself. Russia needs China as a major trade partner and a source of investment, primarily in its eastern regions. Past complications in their relations with Beijing already led to the need to increase military outlays and fend unnecessary alarmist sentiment that was not conducive to the political stability needed for the country's development. The second part is a subjective factor. The Western policy of pressuring Russia, a country it perceives as undermining the Western-dominated world order. Targeted by Western sanctions, Russia has turned to China for both political support and as an alternative trade partner and source of investment and credit. The fact that the West, and particularly the United States, is pursuing a similar pressure campaign against China is spurring Beijing to gradually deepen its relations with Russia. At the same time, Russia understands that there are limits to its strategic cooperation with China. Most importantly, Moscow is unwilling to assume the obligation of fully supporting all Chinese initiatives and positions because in some cases that could complicate Russia's relations with other partners. For example, Moscow would not want to take a specific stand regarding China's territorial disputes with other countries, much less become involved in conflicts over those disputes, should any arise. Nonetheless, Moscow has made several gestures towards China, such as expressing understanding for Beijing's position on Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and supporting its refusal to recognize the decision of international arbitration concerning the dispute in the South China Sea. Moscow, however, is unlikely to express explicit support for Chinese territorial claims, just as China, adhering strictly to its principle of territorial sovereignty, is unlikely to give formal recognition to Russia's actions in Crimea, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and so on. The Russian public also has mixed feelings about an increasingly powerful China. Until most recently, most public opinion polls showed that Russians considered China the friendliest of all countries. According to the special survey of the state-run Public Opinion Foundation, or FOM, that was conducted in July 2018, 62% of respondents considered China a friendly state. Another survey of February of the same year by another center, Levada Center, found that 70% of Russians have a positive attitude towards Russia. However, according to the latest survey conducted by the Russian Public Opinion Research Center, VCION, on October 2019, only 45% of respondents answered China to the question, with which country do you think Russia now has the friendliest relations? Although China still was on the top of the list, and the lower number may be explained by the fact that this time it was an open question, the indicator was nevertheless somewhat lower than the same question by the same agency put to the public in a year before, 2018. At that time it was not 45 but 50, or 51 in 2014. However, the FOM survey also found that 68% of Russians believe that China is developing faster than Russia. At the same time, 52% of respondents said they had either read articles or books or watched films or TV shows devoted to China, while 47% of Russians had not read or watched anything about the country at all. Almost half. Also, 57% of respondents said that Chinese culture, values, and lifestyle differ markedly from that of Russian. As many as 52% of Russians said that they would like to visit China, but 46% said they had no desire to go there. At the same time, given a choice between visiting Europe or China, 49% said they would prefer to visit Europe and only 27% China. So overall, one can conclude that Russians are learning more about China and relating to the country better all the time. At the same time, a certain awareness towards China remains. In political circles, this is most common among pro-Western liberals and extreme nationalists. However, given the political center has consolidated around the government and its policies, the right and left-wing fringes have become very small in number. Still, if the situation in the country worsens considerably, those fringe groups could theoretically regain influence. Thus, the same political, economic, and cultural factors that are facilitating Russian-Chinese rapprochement are simultaneously limiting how close the countries can grow. Another factor which influences bilateral relations are changes in the style of Chinese foreign policy. The growing assertiveness that experts noted in Chinese foreign policy, starting from the late I would say the second decade of this century, could prove a significant obstacle to further rapprochement. Since then, a number of publications by Chinese journalists and experts, particularly those in the military, have called for Beijing to follow the US example. They advocate pursuing a foreign policy that would rely on shows of force to increase geopolitical influence and support foreign trade relations. At that time, the Chinese authorities said those were only private opinions and did not reflect official policy, and like China was a democratic country, of course, and there are many opinions exist there. However, the Global Times newspaper, which is a newspaper of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, soon became more popular, and its editor, former military correspondent Hu Xijin, was an open supporter of a more assertive approach. He encountered opposition from advocates of more traditional diplomacy based on the ideas of Deng Xiaoping, who favored modesty as expressed in the maxim Tao Guang Yang Hui, meaning approximately bide your time and keep a low profile. Now, however, it's quite clear that policy of assertiveness has clearly gained the upper hand. This creates a serious contradiction between the officially stated goals of Chinese diplomacy and their political implementation. Official documents speak of mutually beneficial arrangements, 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, non-interference in international affairs of other countries, respect of the principle of international law, and the fundamental difference between the foreign policy of Beijing and that of hegemonic policies pursued by other major powers, especially the United States. In reality, though, a growing chorus of voices charged China with subjugating other states with debt and Chinese companies with violating other countries' labor laws, bribing local officials, polluting the environment, making ineffective investments, failing to hire local workers, and so on. Beijing also stands accused of using its citizens, overseas students, and ethnic Chinese living abroad, the so-called Huaqiao, to interfere in the affairs of other countries. Already, China is establishing military bases abroad, having opened its first foreign naval base in Djibouti in 2017, although it doesn't call it a base. It's also applying economic sanctions against its neighbors, countries like Mongolia or South Korea, and even attempting to dictate policy to the government agencies of other countries. Of course, from Moscow's point of view, even those moves fall far short of the past or current deeds of such classic superpowers as the United States, the Soviet Union, and even colonial European states. Moreover, some of the accusations leveled by the United States and its allies are unfounded and represent an obvious attempt to apply ideological pressure in the competitive struggle between great powers. But in any case, the trend is clear. Beijing is beginning to use the same instruments of influence as other powers do, but does not admit to doing so in its official foreign policy rhetoric. Unofficial documents paint a different picture. If you read Chinese expert literature and journalistic commentaries, you can find out that they often point to the need to open numerous military bases in various parts of the world, to use the army to protect the country's economic interests abroad, and to apply sanctions as a means to pressure the government of other countries. Even the style of Chinese diplomacy has changed. Senior Chinese diplomats who actively use modern methods of communication, including many foreign social networks and messenger services that are banned inside China, speak in a very pushy manner with foreign journalists, experts, and politicians, telling them how to behave and what they can or cannot write, threatening to blacklist them for the wrong views, and sometimes behaving downright rudely. Because senior leaders never criticize them for it, we can assume they consider such behavior, which is actually reminiscent of the style last seen during China's Cultural Revolution, to be not only normal, but perhaps even desirable. Beijing also uses Chinese citizens, teachers, and college students working or studying in foreign institutions to push the government's official line on various historical and international issues. What's more, they are often overly insistent on pushing their point of view, disrupting the classroom environment and damaging otherwise friendly relations among colleagues at work. This policy is extremely counterproductive for China itself. The Beijing authorities invest enormous energy and considerable sums on propaganda that promotes its achievements and international image, holding hundreds of conferences and other PR-related events, publishing literature and funding and staffing almost 500 Confucius institutes around the world. Of course, China does have something to tell the world. It is an ancient country with a unique culture, whose leaders have managed to achieve an unprecedented 3-decade-long economic boom, raising living standards for the population. Many people around the world find this extremely attractive, and China should be proud of this accomplishment. However, with that understandable pride growing into haughtiness, and Beijing dismissing other countries' experience and trying, however unsuccessfully at times, to tell them how to organize their lives and which values to embrace, could indicate a return to the xenophobia that characterized the Chinese empire and that ultimately led to its collapse. Despite counter-efforts by the Chinese authorities, all these factors have made China less popular in many countries, and particularly among its neighbors. According to a survey conducted in 2019, 63% of the people in South Korea held a negative opinion of China. That figure stood at 85% in Japan, 57% in Australia, 54% in the Philippines, 46% in India, and more than 50% in every European country except Greece. This, despite the fact that many of those countries once had extremely friendly feelings towards China. Japan, for example, was rather friendly in the 1980s. Even in regions such as Africa, South America, and Eastern Europe, where opinions towards China are somewhat more favorable, this indicator is sliding downward. It seems certain that Beijing's decision to embrace a policy of assertiveness is leading China towards serious problems. Given this situation, it is unclear how China can implement its extraordinarily ambitious and geographically expensive Belt and Road Initiative that is predicated on Beijing's winning the cooperation from numerous states. So what are Russian attitudes towards China? Until recently, China's popularity has been growing. Moscow is officially developing a strategic partnership with Beijing, making China not only a friend, but practically an ally. However, the reality of those relations is different. Beijing's attitude towards Moscow is evolving along the same lines as with other countries, albeit with some delay. This shows that Beijing acts assertively not just towards its enemies, but towards everyone. Such behavior has become a sort of craze that Chinese leaders are either unwilling or unable to stop. And despite official statements to the contrary, there is a growing imbalance in Russian-Chinese relations. For example, Chinese television companies freely broadcast their programs on Russian airwaves, primarily as part of the package of channels offering by satellite TV services. Chinese media outlets also operate in Russia and sometimes in the Russian language. The converse is not true, however. China legally prohibits the broadcast of foreign media, with the result that only a handful of the country's largest hotels air any Russian television programs. Many Chinese books on history and social and international subjects are published in Russia. However, China will publish Russian books on the same subjects only if they do not contradict the official position and those rules are growing increasingly restrictive. I have my own experience with this. My 2 books were translated in China but not published for some reason. Perhaps they were not good enough, I think. As a result, China now has a significant backlog of books written by Russian authors that have been translated into Chinese but not yet approved for publication. In 2016, Moscow was home to the gala opening of the Museum of the 6th National Congress of the Communist Party of China. The museum is controlled entirely by the Chinese side and is formally a branch of the Chinese Cultural Center in Moscow. Of course, the museum promotes the official Chinese version of party history and Soviet-Chinese relations, an interpretation that does not correspond to the results of unbiased research. It is Russia's only museum run by foreigners. At the same time, many museums in China, including those devoted to Russian-Chinese relations, prohibit entry to foreigners, including Russians. The official version is not to harm those relations. You are not allowed to go there. Moreover, Chinese authorities relocate monuments to the Russian troops who freed Northeast China from the Japanese in 1945, from their locations in city centers to the outskirts or more deserted localities. And they do not so far more frequently than is done in Eastern Europe, to whose actions Moscow responds with much greater annoyance. Beijing's official rationale is a desire to free up space for the movement of transportation flows, but it is probably at least partly motivated by a desire to hide from the Chinese people the role that foreign forces played in halting Japanese aggression. That is kind of growing nationalism. And this is done despite the fact that the senior leadership in Beijing openly acknowledges the assistance the Soviet Union rendered in that struggle. As a result, many Russian citizens and business directors are increasingly wary of the new assertiveness displayed by their Chinese partners. And with a growing number of Russian scientists arrested and convicted of spying for China, bilateral scientific cooperation has become a dangerous line of work. China's increasing focus on ideology and censorship interferes with deeper cooperation in the social science as well. In July 2020, Russian media and society reacted quite nervously to a surge of China's nationalism caused by the Russia's embassy in China video post in its official Weibo, which is a Chinese social network, a Weibo account on the 160th anniversary of the city of Vladivostok. Many Chinese netizens, including Hu Xijin, the editor of Global Times, criticized Russia since, according to the official Chinese version of history, the city was founded on the territory annexed by the Russian Empire according to an unequal treaty, or what they call in China an unequal treaty. For Russians, Vladivostok, which literally means the ruler of the East, is a symbol of its vast but underpopulated far eastern region, which borders the densely populated China. All this shows that Russian-Chinese relations are changing. Russian leaders are not unequivocal in their approach to China either. Of course, Russia continues to view China as an extremely important trade, economic, and geopolitical partner, especially given Russia's current confrontation with the West, that makes Moscow more amenable to making certain concessions to Beijing. In addition, Russia's political system is increasingly coming to resemble the Chinese system that Moscow understands far better than it does the Western system. At the same time, Moscow is increasingly concerned about the deepening disparity in the two countries' economic might, as well as Beijing's massive military buildup and its growing assertiveness mentioned, which I was talking earlier. Although Russia rarely makes these concerns public, or at least Russian officials, they do exist and exert an influence on Moscow's actions. So, what can we say on this basis on the future of bilateral relations? Of course, the pressure that the United States and the West as a whole are exerting on Russia is much stronger and poses a much greater threat to its interests than does China's growing assertiveness. This makes it necessary for Russia to strengthen its relations with China. It also makes sense from the geopolitical point of view for Russia to pursue closer relations with a less formidable center of power to balance pressure from a more powerful center. This does not mean, however, that Moscow leadership will long close its eyes to reality, lulling itself into a false sense of security with its own slogans about the growth of mutual trust, the fundamentally new character of their mutual relationship, and so on. Russia's geopolitical and security imperatives remain unchanged, and the no-nonsense geopoliticians in the Kremlin understand this perfectly well. For this reason, and because Russia and China share a wide range of common interests, they will continue to maintain close relations, at least as long as the United States preserves its strategic superiority and pursues a hostile course towards both countries. If China becomes more powerful overall than the United States, it could lead to a serious change in the balance of power in the world, and this, of course, would influence Russian foreign policy. The coronavirus pandemic changes the situation all around the world. On the one hand, states are turning inward, causing a trend towards greater insularity. On the other hand, they now better understand the need to work together to overcome natural disasters. Initially, at least, this strengthens the trend towards greater international cooperation and weakens confrontation, as does the need to collectively overcome the global economic crisis caused by the pandemic. The new situation might relieve Russia of the need to make a tough choice between Western or Eastern partners, from having to focus only on those that can counterbalance the United States. In China, economic problems could temporarily ameliorate the trend towards assertiveness because Beijing will feel more compelled to cooperate with the world's leading economic powers. Unless its political system undergoes fundamental changes, however, such a trend would probably be short-lived. It seems inevitable that China or any other country experiencing newfound strength would become more assertive. It is therefore unlikely that Moscow would strive to achieve even closer relations with Beijing by attempting, for example, to establish a formal alliance with China. China has no need of Russia as an ally anyway. The trend towards assertiveness runs contrary to the idea of becoming tied down with formal obligations that could limit the country's sovereignty and freedom to maneuver. It is therefore very likely that the peak of Russian-Chinese rapprochement has already passed. In the future, both parties will exercise greater pragmatism. Also, this might not find expression in slogans or official statements. Washington doubtless understands that a policy of simultaneously pressuring Beijing and Moscow only succeeds in driving them closer together. The advocates of sensible policy in the United States are currently in the minority, however, and those espousing an end of history ideology prevent them from acting. Nevertheless, the global trend is towards pragmatism. So let me stop here, and I hope we'll get some questions.
Right, thank you so much, Alexander, for painting such a different picture to what we're used to in the recent decade, at least. We have one question from user Sergey Trush. Did you want to ask him? Yeah, please.
Thank you, Professor Lukin, for a very informative talk, and part of this ideas you already published before, but also there's a new information of opinion polls and some your thoughts on the future of Russia-Chinese relations, very interesting. You are the prominent expert in the field with vast contacts with Chinese political class and expert society. So let me ask you the question a little bit broader than your current talk. So I'm interested, what is your reading of China's current domestic political atmosphere after the deterioration of the relations with the states? To be more specific, I would be interested in just this specific issues. First, there's a lot of talk in the first decade, in the year of 2000, during the Hu Jintao period, on the political reform in China, and it was subdued eventually, even prior to Xi Jinping's coming to power. But after the Xi Jinping's come to power, we see the opposite trend of evolution of Chinese political system. It's becoming more authoritarian, more rigid. We know all the domestic decisions that have been made, especially the decision on growing of personal political might of the first leader, the rectification campaign, all that. But after the deterioration with the United States occurred, is there any opposite trends inside Chinese domestic atmosphere towards with a certain blaming or pressuring the Xi Jinping and the current political regime for the deterioration of relations with the states? So to what extent he is being blamed for that, if there is any discussions on that? And is there any new tendencies on the discussions of his, the limitations of his personal authority and personal political functions in future? This is the first realm. The second realm, I would especially interested in this topic. After the deterioration of relations with the states took place, we can foresee that there are different sections of Chinese economy, Chinese political class, military section, ideology, apparatus, internal apparatus, all these sections of Chinese polity has specific interests and specific reflections on what occurred with the United States, and they have specific personal perspectives on how China will be developing after, including the US role or excluding the US role. So how this internal interests of different sections of Chinese polity is being discussed, how they are being exposed, how, to what extent this compromise and how this compromise is, if there is these differences really and distinctly occur, how this compromise is being settled in current domestic political atmosphere. Thank you very much.
Well, you want me to tell you something for what we have very few sources actually, because Chinese discussion opportunities, because of growing censorship and you know, ideology is becoming more rigid. It's becoming more like in the Soviet Union, late Soviet Union. So you have to read or listen or read between the lines. But actually, your two questions are actually one and the same. Well, I would say I'm not in the business of being a, I call them, you know, like there were Kremlinologists in the Soviet, the Western American Kremlinologists who analyzed who sat where and why, you know, and who went somewhere among the leaders, you know. So I'm not a Junanhainologist, and I don't think there's much value in such studies. But in the foreign policy, I have this feeling that, of course, and I think I said in my talk that there are people who still think that China should not have abandoned that Deng Xiaoping's line of being modest. And the war, at least there used to be such people in the foreign ministry, former diplomats, and who said that we should make a deal with the United States, make some concessions, and generally it would be very difficult for us to develop if we don't have at least some technological cooperation with the West. But they would not put it in this way to you. They would say something like, globalization is still very important and we need to, you know, deal with whatever. We cannot change the United States. We should talk to them more persistently and stuff like that. But I know such people, and even personally, they are not in the majority now. But I think they can come back if the situation worsens. So there is, of course, a discussion in China, but at the moment, as I said in my talk, I think that the supporters of tough line got the upper hand. I don't know for how long. Okay.
Right, okay, thank you. I hope Sergey is satisfied with the answer. We have another one from Alexandra Bocharova as well on the in our chat.
Thank you very much, Professor Lukin, for your comprehensive lecture. I have a question. There are some views that among many reasons of the diminishing efficiency of China-Russia relations, there are two mainly important reasons. The first one, the impossibility of cultural understanding between the nations, which makes any kind of soft power impossible. And second, the intensifying political relations between Russian political elites and Japanese as a new trend. How do you assess such views, such reasons? Thank you.
I'm not quite sure what do you mean by impossibility of cultural understanding between the nations.
I mean here that the soft power between the nations, like it makes it difficult any cultural exchanges because the cultures are very different from each other.
Well, I've been talking to my Chinese friends for like 30 years and we have no problem in understanding each other. You know, all people can understand and all cultures can understand each other. And what you mean by misunderstanding is probably that you don't agree with them, but you don't have to agree with anybody. But to understand this, anybody is possible. You just need to make accustomed to the way of the people of other country express themselves. For example, Russians and Chinese. Well, when you laugh in Russia and when you laugh in Chinese, they actually mean different things. But you should, when you know what they really mean by laughing in China, you would understand it. And so I don't see any problem here in understanding other countries. You just have to study them better. And about Russian, Japanese, the intensifying, well, I'm not an expert on Japan actually, but I think that Japan, it is important for Russia to develop relations with Japan as well as to all other countries in Asia, partly because it's important in its own right, because Russia needs them as economic partners and as political partners, but partly also because, you know, China is our great friend, but it's always better to have more friends than less friends, and then just one friend, especially if this one friend is very big and strong. So this is also one of the reasons. So Japan is, of course, an important and also important and proud country. And during Abe period, Russia and Japan made some significant steps of improving relations. And the new prime minister, I think, said he was going to continue the line of Prime Minister Abe. So I think we should use this opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Right, we have a question from Anne Phillips as well. If you could unmute yourself, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks very much. This was very, very interesting. And my question, perhaps too simple, but I was just curious, and I'm always struck by the number of European EU member states, as well as in the Southwest Balkans, that have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative. So I was curious, as I'd be interested in your assessment of how that is viewed from your perch in Moscow, and if that's seen as part of a growing competition, or if it's just seen as interesting way to, or another way to decouple Europe from the US.
Well, quoting Joseph Stalin, I can only say that we should. Well, he said it on another occasion that we should envy China, that it attracts attention of so many countries in the world. But basically, well, I don't think that Russia has any particular views on that. Well, basically, for example, China is very influential in some countries which are also friendly with Russia, like Serbia, for example. And I don't think Russia has anything against it because Chinese influence is probably seen as kind of counterbalance to well, in this case, not only American, but also Brussels influence, and which is positive for Russia. And also it's a very economically strong, I would say, counterbalance. So I think Russia can only support Chinese economic cooperation with European countries. You know that China has this 16 plus 1, or whatever it's called, the 16 group, which group of 16 countries like Eastern European countries, which Brussels saw, or some old European countries saw as an attempt of China to kind of split European Union, but it was not an intention of China. It means they don't understand China at all. It was a purely bureaucratic idea, because in Chinese, all Chinese bureaucratic institutions, Eastern Europe and Western Europe are divided. There are different departments in charge of it. So it was just a different department which was in charge in the foreign ministry, for example, in charge of Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So there was no plot here. But for Russia, there's nothing wrong in China's attempts to cooperate with those countries.
Thank you.
Okay.
Right, thank you so much. We have something from Vladimir Baranovsky as well.
Oh.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, Academician Baranovsky.
Yes.
It's my great pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to participate in this event, although for me it's only first experience. I think that we have listened to your analysis with a great interest. I have learned quite a lot, especially because I'm not an expert on China. But I have two questions which I would like to address to you exactly on this Chinese-Russian interaction. My first question is about your assessment of the prevailing mood in Russia on China in strategic perspective. Is China as a strategic risk, or is China as a strategic chance in terms of trying to find Russia's own place in the international system? And another question is about China. Can you imagine China as a great power, as an emerging great power with non-assertive foreign policy? Again, I have very superficial understanding and knowledge about Chinese foreign policy, but I think that there was a certain period somewhere, well, the first 2 decades after the beginning of Deng Xiaoping reforms, where we could say that there was an interesting image of China not producing this feeling of assertiveness in terms of its foreign policy behavior. Or maybe I am wrong. Thank you.
Well, I would say, thank you very much. The first question is actually quite simple. And the second is very complicated. Well, it's simple because, of course, China is an opportunity for Russia. I mean, if there is no China, then Russia is alone with the United States, and it would have been much more difficult for it. But China is a part of a multipolar world, or the emerging multipolar world, in which such country like Russia, which is you can call it one of the emerging poles, but it's not one of the strongest poles. It could play and balance and play some kind of role or game between the major powers, just like China played within. Of course, you surely remember this idea of triangle when Russia, China, the Soviet Union, China, and the US. Which was talked about in the 70s and 80s. At that time, China was the weakest angle of the triangle, but it was important because everyone wanted good relations with it. So Russia could play some kind of similar role. So despite the fact that it is at least economically weaker, it doesn't mean that it's not important. Without China, it couldn't have been doing that. Now, the second question is interesting because there is no answer. We can only speculate. Well, there are two trends in China's China's like communist period foreign policy, and one is this Deng Xiaoping tendency, and the other is activist foreign policy, which began, well, you can call it 1960s, for example, this, trying to help revolutionary movements, to assist revolutionary movements in Asia, and kind of activist foreign policy of cultural evolution. So the problem is actually if China is going, if a strong China, because the entire thinking of Chinese revolutionaries, all Chinese revolutionaries, including the communists, was to create a strong state. And now Mr. Xi Jinping announced that he realized this Chinese dream. China became a strong state. So is this state is going to be just like other strong states? Because historically, all strong states behaved in kind of superpower way. But basically, what is also true historically, all of them except one were Western, European or the United States. Another one, Japan, kind of joined this Western style because it joined strong countries in the end of the 19th, early 20th century. And when you read Japanese documents of that time, you understand that they just wanted to behave as other European predators. But China historically was not an aggressive power. It became big and strong not because it won many wars. I don't think it actually won any wars for a long time. Maybe in the 20th century, maybe a small war with India. But they were not very good at fighting. They were good at trading, at creating bureaucratic apparatus, but not by wars. So it depends on the Chinese tradition, I would say, works in the direction of being non-imperialist and non-great power policy. But China is not very traditional. It also is a quite modern country. It looks at the United States. You can see and read Chinese, well, non-official writings on foreign policy, and many of them just say we should be just like the United States, not like Chinese empire, but just like the United States. So, you know, there are two tendencies, and I have no answer to your second question, because I don't know which tendency is going to win in the end. I'm not sure if it was a good answer.
Okay, I think Professor Baranowski, are you trying to respond? Because we then have to.
But there's no voice.
No, because it's muted. Yeah.
Oh, is it possible to respond? Do you have time? Do we have time for this?
Sure.
Listen, I'm quite happy with the second question, just for a very simple reason. It's a very complicated question, and it's not complicated only because of China. It's complicated even about great power. We know the history of great power. We know that great power, and especially those who tend to become superpower, they tend to have a sort of a foreign policy. But the interesting question, to which we do not have answer, is whether it is possible to change this status, whether it's possible to imagine a great power which would continue to be great power without being assertive. Because we also know that history tells us that not only Western countries were great powers, but also that great powers collapsed. And they collapsed very often. It's just enough to read the Paul Kennedy book about this. They collapsed because of overextension of their foreign policy, of their external obligations, of their attempts to be excessively assertive in their behavior in the international arena. Maybe China, with its history, with its tradition, you mentioned this non-imperial character of Chinese tradition. Maybe China could give us an example of a new type of great power, which would not create such risks for other international actors because of its assertiveness. Although what you said in your lecture, it was basically an argument for an opposite conclusion. You were saying about China, who is becoming assertive with respect to many other countries, including the one which is trying to position itself as a kind of a strategic ally with China. So it's, I think that it's a debatable question.
Thank you for sparking debate, Professor Baranowski. We are going to have to give other participants the floor as well. Professor Gilbert Roseman is raising his hand, I believe.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I have two questions. One is, what is the degree to which others support and acknowledge the concerns about China that have just been raised? When I read articles by some, like Yuri Tavorovsky, I don't see any sense of this concern. In fact, there's a suggestion that China now, because it's under pressure from the United States, is more differential, needs Russia much more, and that Russia is in a better position, rather than the view that China's assertiveness is being directed at Russia too. My other question is, has Russia missed an opportunity when so many world leaders were really interested in improving relations? Donald Trump just adores Vladimir Putin, we know that. Never said a negative word about him once, despite some US policies. Abe has pursued him, Moon Jae-in has pursued him. Is there a sense that Russia may have been missing an opportunity not to be able to figure out a way to work with one or more of these leaders? That's my question.
Right. So the first question is kind of, it's difficult to assess, you know, in percentage or whatever, how many people are wary about China's policy. But we certainly have such people. Well, you mentioned Tavrovsky, but this is one kind of radical end of Russian sinologists. He's the kind of the most pro-Chinese, I would say, who wrote a book about Xi Jinping, an article about his wife and whatever. We like him very much, but we understand that he does not reflect the views of everybody. There are also alarmists, as I say. You know it probably better than me. Somebody like Rapprochement or people like that, who say that China is an imperialist state and only, you know, only waits for an opportunity to conquer Russia. But what we are interested in here are about the position of the leadership, because the leadership, the government decides on the policy. And I cannot tell you, because these are only feelings kind of, but my feeling is that they are very practical people, and they understand the problems, and they think that we need to improve relations with Russia, with China, but it doesn't mean that China is a kind of, it does mean that they do it unconditionally. And my feeling is that this feeling of understanding that China is not an ideal partner is kind of growing at the moment, but I may be wrong. So, so the second question, yes, is Russia missing an opportunity? Well, this is a very, well, forgive me for my rudeness, but this is a very American question. I mean, you seem to kind of assume that it's in Russia's interest to kind of go and beg for good relationship with the United States and Japan, and doing something, making some concessions to do that. But the thing is that first, Russia has done that already, and it didn't lead to anywhere. I mean, if you make a concession to the United States, they take it, but they don't give you anything in return. So, I mean, do you really think that if Putin gives something to Trump, I don't know.
I don't think you understand Trump. I think Trump is unlike any leader the United States has ever had. And he just wanted so badly to make a deal with Putin. But also Abe. This is another guy who really wanted to make a deal with Putin. So you act as if you only have one-sided concessions, when I think both of those leaders, among possibly others, were really willing to make some concessions.
But it depends on the terms. I mean, he wanted to do concessions, but he didn't want to. He wanted to make a deal with Russia, but his understanding of the deal was unacceptable to Russia. That's the problem.
That's why you negotiate. That's why you test it. But
well,
I don't contest it.
They've been negotiating for a long time. And
I don't think those were real negotiations. Nor do I think for the Abe that the responses suggested that Russia wanted to make a deal. I actually think Russia-Japan relations have reached a dead end because Japan had such high hopes, and then they felt the response was inadequate.
And by the way, they are also negotiating with the United States. The negotiations are going on, but I understand that you don't like Trump, because I've never seen an American professor who likes Trump, but but it does mean that Trump likes Putin. He likes people who give him something without giving anything in return. That's why they have problems. If he, well, just now they made a so-called proposal on the START treaty. And this was like, basically it was unacceptable to Russia from the very beginning. Everyone understands it. So this is not a kind of negotiation Russia needs. And I think that Russia's position is quite correct now. It's waiting until, I mean, why should Russia improve relations with Japan? I mean, it would be nice to improve relations with Japan, but it's not vital to, it's not that vital to Russia, for Russia to make political, to make, for example, what do you mean Putin should do? Like give up the islands, for example, or part of them.
This is a whole new seminar, which we are going to hold on the 28th of September, by the way. Just an ad for the future.
With Professor Togo, by the way. We're having the next seminar with Professor Togo, our good friend.
I will join you.
Great.
We look forward to the discussion.
We'll ask him about it. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We also have a final question, I'm afraid, from Professor Andrei Korneev as well. And apologies to those of you who didn't have a chance to ask their questions. If you could do so in private later. So Professor Korneev, please.
Звук. Вот теперь мне включили. Thank you. My own impression about the current state of bilateral relations is somewhat similar to Professor Lukin's. But my question is whether your conclusion is totally based on your intuitive perception, especially for this unusual year when a lot of countries blame China for the pandemic, etc. But could we construct some kind of instrument to measure the state of bilateral relations between what you have concluded is a very sinister prediction that our relations with China have already passed the best period, and now what we could face is the slide towards worsening relations. So could we have some kind of barometer of relations between Russia and China? And could the result of your study become a self-fulfilling prophecy if it will be cited by a lot of scholars both in Russia and abroad? Thank you.
Well, first, I didn't say that our relations are going, if we pass the peak, it does mean that we are going to, our relations are going to be worse. I exactly said that, I specifically said that relations are not going to be worse. They're just not going to be much better than at the moment, because geopolitical factors are still there. The United States is pursuing the same policy, and even they change the president, is going to be more or less the same. I think, well, some style may change, but Biden basically agrees that China should be kind of contained. So I don't think that relations are going to be worse, and it's not a prophecy. And when you say, when you ask about my sources, it's not just intuition. If you read articles, well, I cannot show you the sources at the moment, but it's based on a lot of articles, including Chinese articles. For example, when I say that there is a discussion on sanctions in China and how better to use sanctions, despite the fact that officially China says that they don't apply sanctions, well, you can read some Chinese journals and see that there are many articles discussing sanctions and how to use them better. And about Russia, yes, you can also read articles and analysis, including some, think tanks, which would argue, which would also show you this trend towards assertiveness in China's policy. So, well, but we'll wait and see. I also, like you and academician Baranovsky, think that China may become, well, I would also hope that China would be a different great power, not an imperialist great power, not a hegemonic great power, but a different great power. I just wanted to show some tendencies that that contradicts it, but there is an opportunity. There is a possibility that at some time in the future, when this policy fails, they return to Deng Xiaoping's policy. It may also happen. So let's wait and see. It would be also unfair not to show this contradictory tendencies. So that's what researchers do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've decided to make some time for another final question from Anastasia Pitashkova. This would be the final one. So, Anastasia, please, if you could ask a question. Oh no.
Is muted. Oh, okay, great. Thank you very much. So I have two questions. The first is, do you see any structural changes in Russian-Chinese relations, or are there any new opportunities that COVID-19 has brought to us? And the final question is about the American factor and the sanctions that China and US are posing on each other. How will they influence Sino-Russian relations, in your opinion? Thank you.
I think I've already mentioned that sanctions are only part of general pressure policy of the United States, which the United States applies, pursues in direction of both Russia and China. This is, by the way, a very strange policy from the geopolitical point of view, because, if you read the geopolitical thinkers like Kissinger or Brzezinski, they both wrote about that the worst thing the United States can do is to create or allow a creation of a force or an alliance which would dominate Eurasia. That's exactly what Obama and Trump were doing, and Trump is doing at the moment. So, but they're doing it for ideological reasons, or Trump, in Trump's case, he probably thinks he's tough enough to confront everybody at once. Well, let's wait and see if he is right or wrong. But generally, of course, this policy is pushing the two countries together. and making rapprochement a bit faster than it could have been without it. So, and what was the first question? I forgot. Sorry.
Nastya, if you could repeat your first question, please.
Maybe
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't mute the mic. The first question was about the consequences COVID-19 for Sino-Russian relations. Are there any new opportunities or structural changes due to COVID?
I wouldn't say there are any structural changes, but Russia and China cooperate in this about COVID itself, and they exchange information, and you know, there's a cooperation between medical institutions and so on. But I don't think there are any structural changes. We are still strategic partners, and the fact that the United States accuses China now of all kinds of strange things about this virus, that you know, I think Trump says that, you know, well, it originated in China, but also there are some people who say that they did it on purpose and, you know, wanted to, you know, send it somehow, spread it in the United States. You know, of course, China doesn't like it, and this also adds to anti-American feelings in China, which pushes China closer to anti-American forces in the entire world, and also pushes in the direction of Russia, because Russia, of course, doesn't accuse China of anything in this respect. By the way, the virus came to Russia not from China, but from Europe. So we have nothing to accuse China of.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Lukin, did you want to add something? Did you want to accuse China of something else? Virus.
Such great people. I would say my teachers came to my talk. So, and I had arrived Gil Roseman and academician Baranovsky, for example. So.
Thank you all for participating. This is great. We look forward to further seminars, and as I've already said, we're going to have one on the 28th of September as well with Professor Togo on Japan and Abe's legacy for the new Prime Minister. Right, it was great to see you all, and look forward to our future interactions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.